I am a professor at the Berlin School of Library and Information Science, EB, at Humboldt-Universität zu Berlin. I'm also affiliated with the Einstein Center of Digital Future, also here in Berlin. But as I'm sure you could tell from that wonderful introduction and from hearing me speak, I'm from the US and am relatively new to Germany. So I'm very excited to be here and to be meeting more people here in Europe, especially after the last couple of years that we've had. It's nice to see some new faces. And I will go ahead and just jump right in. So I think my introduction slide here is probably extra information. I don't think it tells you anything new that Lena didn't wonderfully cover, but I thought a little bit of background to this research might help you understand where I'm coming from. So I do a lot of research about digital preservation, and for me, my interest in that started years ago with disaster planning. So when I was at the University of Michigan, I worked as a reference librarian at one of the libraries, and a project that I was a part of involved creating disaster plans for all of the libraries on campus. And we finished that, and I said, great, let's do the digital collections. Where's the handbook? Where are the guidelines for that? And I kind of looked around, and everybody said, well, no, that sounds like a research question, not a practice question, at least at the time when I was doing this 10 plus years ago. And that is how I found myself as a researcher who studies risk and digital preservation. The very first study that I conducted in this space looked at disaster planning in digital repositories and found that repositories that were trying to become certified as trustworthy were more likely to have documented, articulated disaster plans. And that was the first study that really cemented for me and highlighted the fact that digital preservation and repository certification especially are all about risk, which is what we're going to talk about today. So to start out with, when we're talking about repository certification, obviously that begins with digital repositories. I have here sort of a variety of repository names that you might recognize. Digital repositories such as these, such as GASIS, HathiTrust, the UK Data Archive, they contain information like wide-ranging types of information, cultural heritage, research data, government information, often publicly funded information. It can be digitized, it can be born digital. And while the information itself may seem small, right, the individual file sizes of data in CSV form are tiny, right? But even that tiny file represents possibly millions of dollars or millions of euros in research. And that huge amount of money and time and resources has a lot of value and is important to protect. Although probably a library audience is on board with me with that claim. So because of this value, the digital preservation community decided that it's important to find a way to verify that the repositories who have undertaken the work of preserving and providing access to this digital information are in fact able to do so. And so the way that we have decided as a community to verify this is by conducting audits and awarding certification. There are several different certifications. These are some of the most prominent. I'm going to focus today on ISO 16363, which I will alternately refer to as TRAC, because in the early iteration, that's what the certification was called by the organization conducting the audits. I will also talk about Core Trust Seal in the second half of my presentation. The first study that I did focused on TRAC for several reasons. One was that it was a relatively small certification at the time, right? It's sort of the most intense audit to go through. It's the most difficult certification to receive, but as a result of that, the community is much smaller, right? So at the time of data collection for that study, there were 6 certified repositories. I could do a full population study, and it was also right on the cusp of expansion. And so I knew that it was this interesting opportunity to produce data that could be a baseline for future comparative results. Core Trust Seal is a larger certification, has a larger audience. I'll talk more about it later on, but something important to keep in mind about each of these are that the locations of certified repositories really span the globe when we're talking about certification. It's concentrated largely in North America and Europe, but repositories all over the world are looking to become certified. Okay, so let's talk about the first study. So the standard upon which track certification is based, the ISO 16363 standard, states that a trustworthy digital repository will understand threats to and risks within its systems, right? So these audit and certification processes are primarily about assessing risk and demonstrating efforts to mitigate or respond to those risks. Track in particular, clearly has a very strong mission statement about risk identification. So risk is central to the concept of certification and is linked closely with the ultimate aim of preserving digital information over the long term. Another important tenet of certification is transparency, right? So the ability to demonstrate, usually through documentation, a repository's policies and practices to a group of external auditors is crucial for certification. And through this process of audit and certification, the standard developers, the people who design the system, the auditors, and the repository staff members engage in a process of developing, communicating, and adjusting their understanding of risk. And this is done in multiple ways, right? It's done through the text of the standard, the ways in which the auditors enforce or apply the standard, the types of questions they ask, the types of risks or threats that repositories identify, and the ways that they demonstrate their preparedness to address those risks to auditors. So we've established that the work of digital preservation, and importantly of being able to demonstrate effective digital preservation, is about understanding risk. So I've been using this word risk a lot, right? What does it mean? What am I talking about? Well, a classical approach to risk treats the concept of risk as a knowable, calculable figure, right? It's the idea that the likelihood that something will happen, so the probability of an event, multiplied by the magnitude of consequences if that thing happens, is risk, right? This is a pretty classical standard mathematical approach. And in digital preservation, this is largely the definition that we have used, right? We've taken this approach that we can identify threats, that we can figure out how likely they are to happen, and we can figure out what the consequences would be if they do. And that this process of identification or assessment, right, risk assessment, coupled with explaining how we would respond, shows that we're able to mitigate those risks and therefore preserve digital information long-term, possibly. So here's the part where I give you a spoiler alert for the rest of the talk. This approach, this idea of the classical definition of risk, does not get us all of the way there, right? Taking this definition doesn't actually get us to long-term preservation. Now let's talk about why that is. Okay. So what's missing? Well, the classical approach assumes that people are rational actors, and that when we provide them with risk information, their responses or behavior will be the same, right? It assumes that if I tell you one thing and you one thing and another person, everybody will take in that information, understand it in the same way, and do the same thing. But we know that people are not perfectly rational actors and that social factors influence the ways that they receive, understand, and respond to all kinds of information, including risk information. The track process reflects the classical approach to risk. In the standard itself, right, the term risk itself is not well defined. And so the different groups of actors involved in the process, auditors and repository staff, construct their own understandings of risk and bring those personal understandings into the audit process. Track focuses on identifying risk, which really stops short of the steps needed for digital preservation, in my opinion. Mere identification is not sufficient. Rather, it's how repositories actually respond in the event that a threat is enacted, right? That will determine whether they're able to preserve digital information or not. And so in this research, and really in all of my research, I argue that social factors influence the ways in which actors involved in repository certification understand the concept of risk, and that this has important implications for long-term preservation. So what did I do about that? I have developed a model for the social construction of risk in digital preservation. The initial version of this model, which you see here, consists of 7 factors. And I argue that each of these factors, communication, complexity, expertise, organizations, trust, uncertainty, and vulnerability, influence the ways in which people in digital preservation and the repository audit process specifically construct their understanding of risk. For example, communication can influence how a person perceives risk depending on a number of factors, including the source of information, the method and channel of communication, the means of communication, right? A person might be more receptive to information that's communicated by a trusted source, for example, right? Which also brings in trust. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go detailed point by point through each of these factors, but I am very happy to talk about them later in the question time if there are specific elements that you'd like to know more about. Okay, so I've established the model and now I want to do something with it, right? So the research questions for this study were, how do auditors and repository managers conceptualize risk in the context of a track audit? What are the differences and similarities by which auditors and repository managers understand risk as it has been communicated by the developers of the standard? And to what degree do the 7 factors in the model come into play in the audit process? This was a qualitative study that involved semi-structured interviews and document analysis. So I did interviews with 42 people who are involved in track certifications. It was a full population study, so it covers every certified repository at the time. There have since been 2 additional repositories certified, so we went from 6 to 8. And so I talked with all of those people for 1 to 2 hours, depending on their role in the process. And then I also looked at the text of the ISO standard, the audit reports, so the reports that the auditors wrote as a result of each certification, and any documentation the repositories were willing to share. Again, I'm not going to spend like a ton of time on the details, but if you're really interested in research methods, I'm so happy to talk about them later on. Okay, so the track audit process consists of 3 parts. The first is a checklist or requirements document. The second is an audit process, and then the third part is the awarding of certification. And my study here really focuses on this central dynamic of documentation and communication between the repository staff and the auditors, right? So everything that happens in that part where the requirements have been agreed on and are in place, and now we're trying to figure out how to use them. Okay, so how did all of those different people involved in the track process understand risk? The big question. Their understandings of risk fall largely in line with that classical definition. This quote is one example from an interview with a repository staff member who had a couple of really interesting things to say. First of all, they started by saying that they didn't think people in digital preservation really understand risk, but then they also went on to say that the information they think is lacking are probability and consequences, and they specifically see risk as a calculable number, right? This was really characteristic of my findings. It was largely the attitude that, based on my readings and understanding of preservation, what I expected. Okay, so how does that type of understanding play out through the audit process, and what do each of those three groups of people, standard developers, auditors, and repository staff members, think about risk? What I found was that they understand risk often in relation to specific threats. And I've organized those into some categories, right? So the first is financial, which means the financial sustainability of the repository, right? How stable is funding? Do we know how long we have funding for? Can we keep the doors open? Can we keep our equipment running? All of those things, which I think information professionals are probably very familiar with those concerns. The next is legal. So that includes things like copyright, liability, contracts and agreements, organizational governance. So this includes governance structures within the repository, as well as how the repository is positioned within larger organizations, partnerships, or consortia, right? So a repository might be situated within a university, but it might also be a member of a consortium, and those are all different types of relationships with different governance issues. Repository processes means digital preservation processes. So ingest, migration, the processes that make digital preservation work happen. And then technical infrastructure, meaning hardware, servers, the equipment that it takes to keep our information secure. Okay, so today I'm going to focus on just one of these factors, but again, I'm happy to talk about all of them if you have questions at the end. So what I'm going to focus on here is how the people involved in repository certification constructed their understanding of risk as it relates to repository finances. So this is one of the items from the track audit checklist, which is the ISO 16363 standard. It states that a repository must have a plan in place in order to mitigate against the risk of financial instability. The evidence requested is a written and credible succession plan. So right away, we can see that the developers of the standard are arguing here that there's a risk that the repository could at some point lose the ability to keep the lights on, right? There's not going to be enough funding to keep going, thereby endangering the information that they're preserving. So the risk here is to the information as well as the organization. And what they want to see is evidence that there is a plan for the information to outlive the organization. So in an audit, we begin with the checklist here on the left, right? This is a slide we've seen. Using this checklist, the auditors and repository staff engage in a process of documentation and communication that can last anywhere from like a couple of months to more than a year. So this is a long process of negotiation. During this time, the repository staff prepare documentation in response to the checklist, and the auditors review the documentation. Both sides can ask for information, clarification, adjustments, right, and on and on. For the example of succession planning, what I found is that the auditors wanted to see evidence that the repository understood the threats to the financial stability of their organization and that they had legal structures in place to mitigate those threats by ensuring that the digital content would outlive the repository. So the standard developers explained that it's important for the auditors to talk directly to the people in a repository who are doing the work, right? In practice, all of the communication during a track audit is funneled through one member of the audit team and one member of the repository staff, kind of like a game of telephone. At the end of this process, if the auditors are satisfied that the repository has sufficiently met the requirements, they're awarded certification. At the time of my research, every repository that had applied had received certification. I'm not sure about the results since that time. Now that a different organization is doing the audits, it might be a little bit different. But the point of this process was really like, once a repository had committed to it, to like continue this back and forth until they were like good enough for certification. Okay, so in practice, the auditors want to see credible succession plans, and the repositories all provided those plans. Great, check, certification, right? You've got a plan. If your repository closes, someone's going to take your content. Well, what I found was that the repository staff don't believe that a succession plan is actually evidence that the risk has been addressed, right? So they're happy to receive certification by performing trustworthiness on the terms that the standard developers and auditors have set, right? They're happy to say, you want a succession plan, here it is. But they don't believe that these terms actually achieve the goal of long-term preservation of digital content. So this quote from another interviewee I thought was really kind of illustrative of this sentiment, which is, if our repository can't like get the funds together to take care of this content that we specialize in, that we are the best place for, and we have the community to do this, like what on earth makes you think that some other place is going to be able to find money that we didn't, or to, you know, gather the support of the same community that had a problem? They also explained that like it's hard to enforce a contract when one of the parties is gone, right? They didn't believe that like they would be able to enforce somebody else taking over their content if their organization had fallen apart. So all of these repositories, right, they received certification on the basis of meeting the letter of the requirements specifically, but not the spirit. So how do we think about the different perspectives here? On the one hand, we have the standard developers, auditors, and repository staff who have established a shared understanding of financial instability as a potential risk to both the repository and the digital content that the repository preserves. But their views diverge about what should be done in response to that potential risk, right? So standard developers and auditors, who are mostly kind of removed from the day-to-day work of digital preservation, believed that a succession plan was evidence that a repository found a way to offset the potential risk of financial instability. Repository staff, on the other hand, didn't believe that the succession plan would actually ensure the long-term preservation of their content. So what's happening in here, right? If we bring it back to this model and think about communication, right? So the process of funneling all communication through two people, like often has the effect of making the repository staff feel like they're not underheard or understood in the process, right? So all of these people are preparing documentation and they'll do it, but they don't necessarily agree with it and they don't feel like they have anyone to say that to. In terms of vulnerability, what I found was that like closeness to the work was an important factor. So the people who are in a repository taking care of that content are the ones who are most likely to also lose their jobs if the content goes away. They're the ones who who are most vulnerable in this kind of a situation, right? If we're talking about how will the content outlive the repository, well, the person who spends every day tending to that content is probably someone who's likely to think, well, if I can't do it, nobody can. Or if we fall apart, like who's gonna step in? And then expertise. So expertise with regard to each specific repository, designated community, right? So the community of potential future users, the funding landscape for those collections, like different perspectives on expertise and different ideas about like the expertise of each individual repository as well as of the individual people in the process really shape their idea about longevity of information. So communication in the audit process enables them to agree that the risk exists. The repository provides requested information, but doesn't engage in deeper conversation about whether the plan achieves the goal of preservation or not. All of this results in a repository certification that reassures everybody except the people who actually receive the certification. So bringing this like kind of stepping back a little bit, in digital preservation, we've done an excellent job of thinking about risk in technical, economic, and organizational terms. I argue here that it's time to add social to that list. Understanding risk on these terms is important, but it's also important to understand that it's how people behave in response to these types of information, in response to technical, economic, organizational information that actually determines digital preservation outcomes. And we need to think meaningfully about the experiences and judgment of the people who create and manage technology and need to consider them a part of this larger ecosystem in order to be able to effectively preserve digital content. To that end, at the end of this study, I made 2 updates to the model for the social construction of risk. So first, I added an additional factor, political culture. This was something that showed up enough in this first study that I felt like it needed to be brought into the model and examined, but the track certification system was almost entirely US based, right, or North America, the US and Canada, and even like the standard developers are primarily in North America. And so future studies that can look at certification systems that are larger and that cut across like a wider array of political cultures will be able to more deeply examine this factor. The second thing I did was to split the factors into 2 categories, primary and secondary, based on their prevalence, how they showed up, and what kind of influence they had in the process. So the primary factors are communication, expertise, uncertainty, and vulnerability. And the secondary factors are complexity, organizations, political culture, and trust. The next study that I'm going to talk about is one in which I'm sort of further refining and testing this revised version of the model. And another thing that I'm starting to think about and look for are dividing things not just by looking at primary and secondary factors, but also by looking at which factors tend to operate at the social level versus the individual level, right? So groups versus individuals, to see what that looks like. Okay, study 2. I'm super excited. This is the first time I'm talking about this one. It is in progress, so I'm sharing preliminary results. This is the research that I'm doing here now in Berlin. And I'm thrilled. So now I'm looking at Core Trust Seal, which, if you're familiar, this may be like information that's not new to you, but it is a reasonably new certification system, and it is the system that has taken and combined two legacy certifications, Data Seal of Approval and World Data Systems. And so what that means, roughly, if there are Core Trust Seal people in the audience, I'm sure there's a more detailed and elegant way to explain this, but what that means is that repositories with either of those certifications, once their certification lapses and it's time to recertify, they recertify into Core Trust Seal instead. So Data Seal no longer issues new certifications, but your Data Seal certification stays good until it either expires or not. And same with World Data Systems. So at the moment, there are repositories with all three of those certifications, but the number of legacies is getting smaller as they hit their recertification points. The really interesting thing to me about Core Trust Seal, and the reason that I'm choosing this certification for my next project, is that this this relationship here of standard developers and auditors on the one hand, and repository staff on the other that we saw in track, right, is not as separate and distinct in Core Trust Seal. So in Core Trust Seal, once you are certified, you become a member of the Core Trust Seal community, and it's very likely that somebody in your repository will then become a reviewer for new certifications, right? So if you are the staff member of a certified repository, it's very possible that you will also be an auditor at some point. And in the track study, I found that the repository staff really had different ideas than the standard developers and auditors. Well, what happens when those two groups aren't separate anymore, right? Do they have more confidence in the certification, less? Like, what happens? I'm super curious to find out. And that is why I chose Core Trust Seal for the next study. Okay, so the goal of this research is, again, to understand how stakeholders in this process construct their understanding of risk. And I'm doing that by asking questions about how they construct their understanding of risk, what are the similarities or differences across groups, how do the factors from the model affect an audit, and I'm also asking how stakeholders perceive the value of Core Trust Seal certification. So what's the value proposition to them of certification? Because that's something I came out of the track study really curious about, right? Okay, so today I'm going to be focusing on preliminary results from phase 1, which is a survey of Core Trust Seal certified repositories. Phase 2, which is interviews and document analysis, are currently in progress, and given the current situation, we are deciding what to do about observations and a workshop, which were planned for phases 3 and 4, but obviously were planned as like in-person, face-to-face events with people, which may or may not be possible once it's time for those things. So this is also a research story about COVID accommodations and pivots. Okay, so let's talk about the survey. The survey was sent via email to one representative from each Core Trust Seal certified repository, and it was distributed with the cooperation of the Core Trust Seal board, who really generously helped me send out the survey invites to their 163 member organizations. The survey involved an initial invitation as well as some reminders, and at the end, after cleaning all the data and responses, I was left with 88 completed usable survey responses, which gives me a response rate of about 54%, which is pretty good. Okay, So data analysis is currently in progress, but I'm super excited to share some early findings from the survey. So the survey specified that only one respondent per repository should answer. And we did include some questions to check that we didn't have multiple people from the same repository responding. Those are used only for sort of checking purposes, and then for de-identification reasons are not part of the final data set, so I'm not linking responses to particular repositories. But what I found was that not everybody had Core Trust Seal certification yet, right? So there were still some people that had these legacy certifications. And it was also kind of an interesting thing to see. So I asked them to tell me, select all that apply. What certifications have you received? Only 20 of the repositories were Core Trust Seal only. So most of them had been part of this community for long enough that they had moved up from one of the legacy certifications. And there was a little bit of overlap, not much, between Data Seal of Approval and World Data Systems, but then of course a lot of repositories that had re-upped into Core Trust Seal over time. And as a few more years tick by, a table like this should show everybody with Core Trust Seal and no other certifications. But for me, it's interesting because part of what I'm looking to find out is which places have been through the Core Trust Seal audit specifically. So not every member of the community. Oh, also, I didn't include the information here, but sort of an interesting note is I asked them if they knew whether their repository intended to recertify with Core Trust Seal if they didn't have it yet. And many of them did or were on the fence, but the results and the write-in responses seem to indicate a good level of confidence and commitment to remaining a member of this community. Okay, so as far as the individual respondents, I asked them about their role at the time of the audit, as well as their current role. Participants identified themselves across a variety of roles, and as you can see, it appears that most are in roles with the same function as the role they held at the time of the audit. And again, these are sort of different perspectives, but it's a good distribution of people and is not dissimilar to the sort of array of roles from the track study that I did. So I also asked them, what did you do for the audit, right? What was your job? What were you involved in? Nearly everyone had been involved in preparing documentation, and more than half had interacted directly with the reviewers or the auditors. Now, since there was only one respondent per repository, this isn't particularly surprising, right? It could still be the case that in this process, that communication goes through one person, like that game of telephone we had in track. This is something I'm learning more about during the interviews. So then I asked, have you been a reviewer for another repository's certification, right? This is one of the things I'm super interested to find out is what happens when somebody in this group of repository staff members that had really different ideas than the auditors and standard developers, what happens when they are also an auditor? So of the 88 respondents, 27 said yes. So of those 27, and 4 had an other response. So that gave me 28 people. And of that group, there's a pretty wide variation of how many audits they've been a part of, right? So 1 to 2, 3 to 5, or more than 6. And given the amount of time and effort that the audit process takes, it's shorter for Core Trust Seal than for track, but it's still a really involved process. This means that these people have been pretty deeply involved and have had to really thoughtfully consider the requirements and decide whether a repository is trustworthy or not based on those requirements. So how does that, like, what does that mean for risk? You'll recall these were the types of risk that I found from the track study. I gave those same possible sources of risk to survey respondents and asked them to rate them on a Likert scale, right? So please rank them in order from least to most significant. What I found is that financial risk, again, is huge, right? It was overwhelmingly the top choice for most significant and the bottom choice for least significant. Legal risk was very low. People really didn't think that was the most important. Most people thought it was the least important. And then the other factors like really fell somewhere in the middle. The really strong emphasis on finance and financial risk is consistent with my previous findings, but what I'm curious about now is like, what does that look like when we really get down into the requirements for something like succession planning? So the Core Trust Seal checklist is divided into 3 sections: organizational infrastructure, digital object management, and technology. I asked participants to take those 3 sections and rank them in order of importance for determining whether a repository is able to preserve digital content long-term. And they rated organizational infrastructure as most important, although it was really kind of close. Like, you can see the numbers are not that different, right? Technology was almost equal with organizational infrastructure, and digital object management was not far behind. So people really felt that they were all important. None of these sections has like single digits in any of the areas. Or no, sorry, I'm reading it wrong. Organizational infrastructure and digital object management were both rated as most important by a lot of people. Technology was rated as least important by most people. There we go. Had my axes mixed up. So what did I do with this information? I took the people who said that that organizational infrastructure, I'm getting tongue-tied. Okay, so I took the people who said that organizational infrastructure was most important and walked them through kind of a scenario. So within this section, one example requirement is a continuity plan, which is really similar to a succession plan, right? Among participants who ranked organizational infrastructure as the most important section, most of them agreed that having a continuity plan is necessary for long-term preservation of digital content. They agreed that the suggested information for this requirement, which they were presented in the survey, but it was a very large amount of text to put in a slide, would be sufficient to demonstrate that the repository has met the requirement. And they agreed that if a repository met the requirement, that would demonstrate trustworthiness with regard to long-term preservation. So what does that mean? That means they think a succession plan or a continuity plan is important and necessary for preservation. They think that the checklist for certification is asking for the right things to find out if they have one. And they think that if you can meet that requirement and have one of those things that they ask for, it means that you are trustworthy in your ability to take care of digital information long-term, right? So this is a different result than from my track study. This is repository staff who are mostly in agreement with the standard. I'm super curious to find out what's happening here. My team is in the process of coding and analyzing the text responses that accompany this section and subsection. And hopefully the write-in responses are going to give us a little bit more color and a little bit more information about what's driving these answers. And we're also asking about it in the interviews. At this initial stage, it really seems that the staff members are more likely to agree that the requirements of core trust seal certification actually demonstrate trustworthiness for long-term preservation, meaning they think that it kind of shows that their repository's content will survive long-term. But what we're trying to pull apart is whether they think it means that their repository can take care of content or whether the content will outlive the repository. Okay, so those are some early stage findings. What does this mean for repository certification generally? So we've identified risks and documented how we will respond to them, right, as a community in digital preservation, but we haven't taken into account the fact that people aren't perfectly rational actors, and that if a risk is enacted, if it happens, people aren't all going to behave the same way. So for certification, standard developers and auditors in the track standard believe that repositories can demonstrate trustworthiness, while repository staff view the process as performative rather than like actual trustworthiness. Preliminary results from the new study suggest that this is different for core trust seal than for track. And we're now examining why this could be and whether what we found about continuity planning holds up across other sections and other requirements. One of the key differences between these two systems is this like sort of mixing of roles and the fact that the groups are not separate and distinct. And so I'm curious to see like what effect that has and whether that's what's driving this difference or not. That being said, overall, we really need to, I believe we really need to like improve the way that we approach digital preservation and how we decide who's capable of taking care of all this like incredibly valuable digital information, right? I think that this sort of maybe a little outdated or old-fashioned idea that risk identification and a documented strategy for dealing with it makes us trustworthy needs to be revised. And it needs to include something else, right? It needs to include this idea that people act differently, people behave differently, that there are other things that influence what we're going to do and how our information survives, right? Certification, being a trustworthy certified repository, for at least some of the participants in my research, is not the same thing as trustworthiness with a lowercase t, right? And that's a really interesting idea, and it's something that I'm like happy to talk about and talk more about, and it's something I'll be spending many more years researching. So what is that going to look like? We have the survey results, and we're now handling the qualitative part of that survey. So dealing with all of the survey had a lot of written responses, and oh, I'm so grateful to all the participants who spent the time to write them. So my team is currently coding those, and we're going to see what we find. We're in the process of doing interviews with stakeholders to figure out some coloring and some more information to explain our survey results. And then in longer term in the future, I'm interested in continuing to refine and revise this model for the social construction of risk in digital preservation. And I think that one of the future directions for this research is going to be to look at how risk is constructed in repositories that conduct self-audits. So places that fall outside of these official certification systems, partly because being able to become certified is such a marker of privilege. Repositories that do this are like well-funded. They have to have the capability to seek certification in English, which is the official language of the certifications. And then meeting the requirements also relies on all kinds of infrastructure and funding and support and like ideas that really reflect a lot of privilege. And so I'm really curious to see what happens and how repositories that exist outside of that system are also trying to demonstrate trustworthiness. So that's something I'm looking at next. It's still very like preliminary, but if anybody has ideas about that, I would love to hear them. If you are curious about this, or if you liked the things you heard, I have published 2 articles about this research specifically. One is an article explaining the model for the social construction of risk, and the other is about the results from the TRACK study. Here are links to them in my slides, and keep your eyes out. I have hopefully something else coming out in the not too distant future. Okay, and finally, acknowledgements. So the first half of this study was funded by the University of Michigan Rackham Graduate School, and the second half is being funded by the Einstein Center Digital Future. I've had incredibly helpful research assistants, Meg Morath and Carl Haynes at the University of Michigan, and Laura Rotfritz and Maritza Mende at Humboldt-University. And then, of course, all of the participants who have really spent like a lot of time helping me understand what keeps their repository running. Okay,